against people and civilians with impunity, because there's no information, or the information is restricted, no access to information, and so activists, journalists would not be able to document these grave human rights abuses. And with internet shutdowns happening, it really, really restricts the channels of communications in that situation. It also impedes the delivery of humanitarian aid, and therefore it exacerbates humanitarian crisis during conflict, because a lot of people will not be able to access very basic but urgent services during conflict situations. We've seen a number of examples that I want to highlight in times of conflict where companies, businesses, or even the private sector are caught up in where companies have also been either directly or indirectly threatened by the warring parties or those in authority during crisis moments. An example is the exit of Telenor in Myanmar in 2021 when the coup began. I think the company was forced by the military to install some surveillance technology, which would be a violation of people's rights, and so the company decided not to do that, and in the end they had to exit. But the question is, with the exit, who did they hand over the company to, and what does that mean for the human rights of people in Myanmar? We've also seen cases in Gaza, where when the conflict Palestinian voices and pro-Palestinian voices being censored online by social media companies, particularly on Meta platforms. And then, the documentation by activists did also show that there was a history of this kind of censorship happening during crisis moments that companies are also responsible for. And then when we come to Sudan, since last year, April 2023, since the conflict began, we've seen the misuse of technology, or the use of it by the warring parties from internet shutdowns or to damage to communication infrastructure. And so all these restrictions do aggravate atrocities on vulnerable communities and people. And then we can't also, we do want companies to be very accountable in operating in countries, because in every context, operating in a country doesn't mean it's always going to be rosy. And so in times of crisis, there's a need to take the necessary steps to ensure that people's rights are respected, and also providing people with the necessary support that they need, because this is a crisis moment and it needs to be a responsibility of all these companies operating in the country. For Sudan also, we've seen how local authorities or communities, as well as aid groups, are relying on Starlink, which is quite controversial now, but people are relying on it to get connected online. And that is one thing we see. Once the internet is shut down, or once people are struggling to have access to information, they would find alternatives to be connected online, to be able to express themselves or to share information with the rest of the world during crisis moments. However, we've also heard or documented reports of how expensive these tools or alternative tools are, and how communities are not able to afford. And so a majority of populations are still very much cut off in Sudan and in other places where internet shutdowns are being weaponized. And so I want to come to you, Iman, to tell us your experience, first of all, about the shutdown. I know you're based in London, but it definitely would have had an impact on you. So if you can share with us how that has affected you and whether or not Meta did take any actions directly in relation to the internet shutdown.
Thank you very much, Felicia. Okay. I think one of the first things I want to start with or lead with, and I think many people already know that, is that when we speak about computer-mediated politics, Sudan is a textbook case of that. Sudan has like a history of internet shutdowns, a history of censorship, a history of like lack of freedoms and human rights violations. And because of that, the online space played such an important role in the recent history of Sudan. So it was important when a lot of the activists or citizen journalists or alternative media spoke about the different violations from the former president, al-Bashir, when they spoke about the Khartoum massacre in 2019, when the coup happened in 2021, and of course the war and everything. Like, I know these are moments, but everything in between. So, but all of this changes when there's an internet shutdown and there's a war. And I think I wanted to make this point first, because pre-war, or like all of the different instability changes versus active conflict. So for me as a member of the diaspora, and I think I want to attempt to answer this first through this lens of like a member of the diaspora, and a member of like a person who works at Meta, and who feels, even if I haven't worked at Meta, that I'm an informed person who knows how to approach the space. So the first thing is that there is a shutdown and there's active conflict, and you've already known that people are dying actively, like as collateral, like even if they're not active in the front lines. And when this information is severed, the first thing you want to do as a member of the diaspora is like you want to get information about people back home. There's no way to get this information, so you go to the online space. You know that there's a lot of misinformation in this online space, and you're trying to navigate it and do the due diligence that you know what to do. Like, so you look for the citizen journalists that you know about, you look for the medias, alternative media, you look for the civil society. What you forget is that a lot of these people are on the move. So a lot of them are actually trying to prioritize, rightly, the safety of their being or going to other places. So you find no information from the majority of these people. And even if you do, it's very interesting that during war, because it was also created in a sense that it's between two actors, people do take sides. So then that neutrality which you had pre-war, where everybody was for the unity of the country, no longer stays the same. So I think like that's a point that you learn actively there. So when this happens, you realize that you're vulnerable to a lot of misinformation. And by shutting down the people in Sudan and just leaving it to the diaspora, you can already, as a member of the diaspora, be targeted with a lot of disinformation. Because some people are ready to make use of that vacuum of information, and they target you with a lot of propaganda or information, so you do fall prey to that. And this affects the social, the political, and the economic space. Because as you know, the diasporas in many countries in Africa, including Sudan, have always been the front line when it came to political lobbying or advocacy, or you speak about social and economic support when you speak about remittance. So with this misinformation or disinformation, you fall prey to so many things. One of the things that are like the first thing that you think about is to support people back home. Enter fraud. So like fraud comes in the sense of humanitarian assistance, because even though you're aware of all of these things, because of your desire to support people because you know the situation back home. Another thing that happens that makes that space really hard is fact-checking. You think that you have all of the instruments in place, but fact-checking is, journalism at the end of the day. And when you can't really fact-check actively or quickly because of that real-time information element, it delays that part. So like, even if you fact-check it later on, the harm has already happened, in the sense that a lot of people who fall prey again to the misinformation, to disinformation, so what can happen in that space, And particularly in members of the diaspora, it turned, depending on why they left the country, if you left the country for political reasons, it might end up deepening or reopening old wounds. So like the division becomes much bigger, especially that now you want to speak about peace. So that's my diaspora personal hat, but I want to put the Meta hat on. And I want to say that Meta as a company strongly opposes, of course, internet shutdowns and any sort of disruption with the internet, including the throttling. And even temporary disruptions, I think Felicia has already pointed out to the human rights violations, something we know, like its restriction of fundamental freedoms, social and political isolation, the potential for government abuse is something that we've seen. And also since the war in Sudan has happened, we've seen a number of fact-checking missions going to Sudan, human rights fact-checking mission going to Sudan to see what is the situation on the ground. The ICC is still looking at Sudan right now, like since 3 months after the war, they're looking at these atrocities. But it's really counterproductive at the end, and what's interesting is we know it's counterproductive because real-time information is important, humanitarian aid is important, and remember ISIS? Even the US Cyber Command, when they were fighting ISIS, they still thought that shutting down the internet would be counterproductive because everything else goes above that. And I think one of the things that we've also been hearing in the forum in these past 3 days right now is that maybe we need to change how we speak when we speak about human rights violations or human rights foundations. And I think internet shutdown is an easy one because with internet shutdown, it impacts businesses. And when you speak about Africa, at least 80% of businesses are these SMBs, like small and medium enterprises. So it really impacts everybody. So that's the society, right? So it's not just about human rights and about like the companies, it's about even the businesses are impacted. So you're speaking about less than 20. I'm sure that it's more than 80%. So I do think that this, in general, I just wanted to highlight, that internet shutdown element from a company perspective, but also from a personal perspective and how it impacts you, especially when your emotions are heightened due to conflict.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience as well as your professional. And indeed, our monitoring shows that internet shutdowns amplify the spread of misinformation because it just blocks the alternative channels of verification of information that is out there already, and so it further mislead people, and so it doesn't fix the issues that governments tend to use as an excuse to shut down the internet. So I want to turn to Aliu to highlight a recent report that the Business and Human Rights Resource Center put out, and your organization, as you rightly introduced, has been tracking the role of businesses in advancing human rights and also eradicating abuse. And yeah, you can feel free to share the statements your colleague shared with you, and then after that we would take questions or, yeah, so.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Félicia. Effectivement, au niveau de notre organisation, nous travaillons sur toute une palette de droits de l'homme. Bien entendu, la question des entreprises technologiques et les droits de l'homme est au cœur de nos activités et nous avons un département dédié à cela. Et comme je l'ai dit, c'est ma collègue Gaïa qui est le responsable de ce département. Donc, au niveau de notre organisation Business and Human Rights Resource Center, nous suivons et surveillons l'évolution des normes en matière d'entreprise et de droits de l'homme, mais aussi les violations des droits de l'homme impliquant plus de 1000 entreprises à travers le monde. Le rôle joué par les entreprises dans les zones de conflit reste l'un de nos principaux domaines d'intérêt. Nos données nous font malheureusement comprendre que les entreprises ne sont pas et ne peuvent pas prétendre être neutres. Au cours de la dernière décennie, il est également devenu évident que les entreprises technologiques jouent un rôle essentiel dans les conflits. Les États et les groupes armés exploitent les différentes formes de technologie allant de la surveillance l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle pour cibler les personnes, l'aide par les entreprises des médias sociaux pour réprimer les discours critiques et dissidents et l'amplification des discours de haine qui incitent à la violence contre les groupes marginalisés et opprimés. Les entreprises, telles que les entreprises technologiques, tirent profit de leur rôle dans les conflits. Cette tendance ne fera que s'accentuer dans les années à venir, à mesure que la technologie prendra une place importante dans les industries de l'armement et de l'armée, ainsi que dans d'autres secteurs liés aux services essentiels. Ainsi, depuis 2013, notre organisation surveille et suit systématiquement les allégations faites par la société civile et les médias sur les violations des droits de l'homme impliquant des entreprises technologiques. Et à cet égard, une analyse récente sur une période de 10 ans, allant de 2013 à la fin de 2023, a révélé qu'il était particulièrement décevant de constater un faible niveau de réponse de la part des entreprises technologiques. Par exemple, le taux de réponse des entreprises technologiques n'a cessé de baisser, passant de 57% en 2018 à 40% en 2023. De plus, naturel, notre engagement à déterminer les mesures prises par les entreprises technologiques pour faire preuve d'une diligence raisonnable en matière de droits de l'homme dans le contexte de la guerre de Gaza, nous avons également été déçus par le faible taux de réponse. Par exemple, nous avons invité 104 entreprises technologiques à répondre sur leurs pratiques de diligence raisonnable renforcées dans ce contexte, et seulement, figurez-vous, 4 d'entre elles ont répondu à notre enquête. Nous avons également remarqué des réponses différentes à différents conflits, ce qui démontre des approches différentes suivant les conflits et suivant les contextes. Cela nous amène à souligner un problème crucial: le manque d'attention adéquate sur le rôle et les réponses des entreprises technologiques dans le conflit actuel au Soudan. Malgré les 1137 articles que nous avons dans notre base de données couvrant les questions de droits de l'homme liées au Soudan et les 74 articles que nous avons ajoutés à la plateforme numérique couvrant le Soudan en tant que zone de conflit. Parce que nous, ce que nous faisons effectivement, nous essayons à chaque fois de rassembler autant d'informations, autant d'articles, autant de rapports sur la guerre, et effectivement, nous avons des pages uniquement dédiées à cette guerre au Soudan. Mais nous n'avons pas été en mesure de fournir le niveau d'analyse détaillée et de sensibilisation que nous avons pu faire pour d'autres conflits, comme dans le cas du Myanmar, de Gaza et de l'Ukraine. Dans ces 3 cas de figure, on a plus d'informations, plus de détails que sur ce qu'on a actuellement sur la guerre au Soudan. Donc, pour en revenir au rôle des entreprises au Soudan, nous avons enregistré des cas où des entreprises technologiques fournissent des outils de surveillance au gouvernement et aux autorités militaires du Soudan qui seraient utilisés pour cibler des militants, des journalistes, des opposants politiques ou des groupes ethniques spécifiques. Les fournisseurs d'accès à Internet et les autres plateformes sont soumises à des pressions pour transmettre les données des utilisateurs, animer des campagnes de haine et incontrôlées qui conduisent souvent à la violence, hors ligne ou en ligne, et facilitent la circulation des ressources via les plateformes, pour n'en citer que quelques-unes. Les entreprises sont également mises dans une situation où elles doivent mettre en œuvre des fermetures et des blocages d'accès à Internet. Dans tous les cas, les entreprises ont une responsabilité en vertu des droits de l'homme et du droit humanitaire. Malheureusement, nous avons constaté que les entreprises technologiques ne parviennent pas, dès la première étape, à faire preuve de diligence raisonnable en matière de droits de l'homme, et plus précisément à faire preuve d'une entrée et d'une sortie responsable, comme cela peut être nécessaire non seulement pour assurer la protection et la sécurité des utilisateurs et des civils, mais aussi de leurs travailleurs. Nous espérons que cette situation de fait sera remédiée. Ainsi, l'analyse que j'ai mentionnée au cours des 10 dernières années, au cours de laquelle nous avons contacté des entreprises technologiques sur la base d'allégations faites par la société civile et les médias, montre que plus de 30% des cas étaient liés à des conflits et que dans 4 sur 5 cas, les entreprises impliquées avaient leur siège social dans les pays du Nord, tandis que les conflits se déroulent dans la plupart des cas dans les pays du Sud. Et donc, ce paradoxe, cette situation, nous espérons qu'en collaboration avec tous les autres partenaires, doit changer, parce que c'est un fait. La plupart de ces conflits, effectivement, si on prend les entreprises, les grandes entreprises en tout cas, elles nous viennent du Nord, alors que le problème, le conflit, tout ce que ça entraîne se passe au Sud. Ça a été aussi l'un de nos constats qui est tout à fait décevant et contre lequel il faut effectivement agir. Donc voilà les quelques réflexions que je voulais partager avec vous au nom de ma collègue Gaïa. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Aliou. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to transition to you, Isedua, and the key takeaway from the analysis from BHR is the fact that tech companies fail to do due diligence in entry or exiting countries where they operate in. And that doesn't just affect the rights of users, it also has implications for the safety of their workers. And we've seen in cases where workers of companies are threatened. So I want to come to you to tell us what companies can do, or how can the companies be more transparent and accountable in advancing digital rights and pushing back against abuses. And then if there are any frameworks you can cite as well that require companies to be to undertake rights respecting approaches in countries that they operate in.
Thanks, Felicia, and thanks to Iman and Ali already for the really insightful comments. I think just from the conversation we've had already, it's very clear the complicated role that tech plays in conflict. On one hand, one company can both be a perpetrator exacerbating conflict by, for example, with social media platforms, maybe censoring or deprioritizing certain content over others. And at the same time, those same platforms can be the target of governments in other regions. And right now, with so many ongoing conflicts around the world, whether it's in Palestine or in Myanmar, which we've alluded to, Sudan, Russia, we do see the way that governments are weaponizing technology in the midst of conflict. Internet shutdowns, of course, are one of the major ways, and that has, as Imana said, a really important impact not only on people in the country where the conflict is happening, but around the world for the diaspora communities. But beyond internet shutdowns, we see the way things like artificial intelligence is being increasingly used in warfare. Even before conflict, we've already seen examples of how AI is used in predictive policing, for example. So like identifying who could possibly be a criminal. And now we're seeing examples of that being used in the context of war to identify enemies and opposition and who's likely to, cause issues for government. So I think it was Aliu's statement that mentioned technology, because when we have these sort of technologies, no way to stay neutral in that. Also censorship, right? I alluded before to governments actively censoring certain platforms or content that might disagree with the image that they want to present to the world of how the conflict is playing out. Even I believe still is banned in Russia. And some Facebook and some platforms are unable to be accessed in those places. And governments do that because they realize that this is where that alternative and independent sources of information are a really, really big piece of how conflict is understood and how it plays out. We have, also examples of biometric ID being used to identify dead soldiers. So there are so many ways that on the other hand, the tech companies themselves, and we've already talked a bit about the way that content moderation plays a role and in either amplifying or restricting certain voices and the kind of information and storytelling that it allows or that it restricts. And even, even things like where companies choose to build their cloud centers and data centers will increasingly have an impact on how conflict plays out, right? So like where are we bringing more capital, more business support, and how is that going to contribute to like ongoing crises that are in those regions? So one of the things that I was thinking of as the other colleagues were talking is also in conflict we see the kind of disparate response and impact. Sometimes we have like more or less equal parties that are at war, but other times we have parties with a huge power disparity, right? Whether it's one government that has all the resources, the power, and is able to intercept communications, to install surveillance software that another party is not able to, and that becomes like a tool of power to further oppress people who are already in the midst of a conflict. But we also see kind of the disparate impact from the private sector itself, where which Aliu's comments mentioned, where in some cases we've seen very swift response and action taken. So I mentioned Russia, Ukraine. Within, like a few weeks, we already saw lots of statements from companies about how they were going to pull out of Russia and the steps that they were taking to enable that people in Ukraine had access to the internet and access to services. But then we have situations like in Sudan and in Palestine where the response is by and large mainly silence on some issues. So there's a lot that's really, we need to think of the role of how tech plays in conflict and what companies themselves should do. Also, like with the increasing use of sanctions, has a pretty important role to play as well when some governments were able to levy sanctions and how that impacts technology. At Access Now, we did some work around the Russia-Ukraine war when the US and the UK governments were trying to levy sanctions and to prohibit internet, ICT, and tech companies from operating in Russia. And again, like the difference from like a company like McDonald's, for example, exiting a country versus the impact of an internet service provider or a social media platform exiting are quite different. So when it comes to like recommendations of how companies and businesses should operate in conflict, it really depends a lot on where they are in this like, spectrum of services that they provide. And I think my colleague Montserrat will probably talk much more about that. And then increasingly, we're seeing the role that investors actually are playing in this space. So more and more investors, as they make decisions about where to put their money, which companies to support, they're thinking about the way that the companies that they're looking at are either contributing or not to conflict and crises. So increasingly, as this like need and understanding for responsible investment continues, I think that that's going to be an important way for us to like, get accountability from the sector, to be sure that the money that's backing technology is not going into things that facilitate human rights abuses. And to Felicia's last point about frameworks for businesses, the major framework on human rights is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Most of the big tech companies and major platforms all have like public commitments to upholding the UNGPs, which say that companies should undergo human rights due diligence to really understand the impact of their business operations, and then heighten human rights due diligence when they're operating in conflict, and to make decisions based on how to address their most salient risk. And again, I think Montserrat would probably talk much more about that. So there is already a framework for us to use. Like we're not starting from scratch, we're starting from something that exists when we think about what companies' responsibilities are, how they should respond to the conflict, and particularly how to make that response equal so that we don't end up seeing more examples of like one crisis or one conflict getting more attention and support than another in another part of the world. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Isedwa and Montserrat. Your name kept coming up, and yes, so I'm coming to you to highlight the recent report you published. I think it was end of last year. Yes, on exploring tech company responsibility in armed conflicts. But then if there are any other reports that you want to highlight, that would be fine.
No, that's great. Sorry, I think there's I think we published that this year, but the sessions took place last year.
Okay.
No, sorry, but I think there's a few things I want to highlight. First, starting with the ecosystem-wide approach that GNI takes, and I think this is super relevant, is normally a lot of the conversation focuses at the platform level, but really when it comes to shutdowns, we're at ISP level, but sometimes these are siloed conversations. So what this armed conflict and just conflict in general takes place across a technology ecosystem. So what this means is that if there's content that a certain government wants to take down and then a company just says, no, we're not going to do this, then they might go to the ISP level and then say, okay, well, shut down the internet. And so that's just like a very concrete example of how, the ecosystem matters. And my colleagues have pointed to other examples like, cloud service providers or where the data is localized or even, from the moment of the equipment vendor. So I think we need to take an ecosystem-wide approach, and I think that's super important. I think the other thing that is important is the multi-stakeholder approach and the existing frameworks that are currently in place with, of course, now with AI, the need to update some of them. But we have the GNI guiding principles, of freedom of expression and privacy, which were formulated along the same time as the UNGPs. And really what they are, they're a blueprint for companies to follow in order for them to really have responsible decision-making regarding these two kind of elements. And with their corresponding implementation guidelines, they really allow companies to respond in different moments in time. And so that's extremely important because it also brings in right? Sometimes companies will be forced to exit a market because they can't uphold their human rights commitment. It's always, once a company divests, they can't ensure that, but they should do their due diligence to make sure that the sale takes place where the policies and practices that protect people, that's the core of it, continue to be upheld. And this is something that as we look at local, part of my job actually has been focused on local tech companies, and some of them who have divested, like you can see some of these parameters continue to be in place in different places. And that's really encouraging to see. At least mostly at the telco level is what we see. But now regarding the session or the series of learning calls that we hosted that became a report, we hosted 3 learning calls, and I think that's also important, the multi-stakeholder approach. This is a very tricky situation to talk about publicly. A lot of these things, because they affect real people, and companies and civil society, investors, and academics really need a space to come together, and GNI facilitated that alongside CPRI and the International Commission or the Red Cross. And these 3 conversations talked about kind of like where international humanitarian law intersects with international human rights law. Sometimes, as you know, IHL, not to get super technical on this, but international humanitarian law deals with the rules of armed conflict specifically versus international human rights law is more around human rights generally. And in these situations, this is something that, with tech, it's very different the way that things play out. And this is something that it's regularly, the way that you can mentioned is human rights due diligence. There are already also frameworks around enhanced or heightened human rights due diligence, which means really doing a conflict sensitivity analysis before, during, and even after the conflict, right? This is a specific kind of due diligence, also with industry collaboration. This is something that you may not see also publicly, but industry getting together, because a lot of these kind of same issues, if they operate within the same market, right? And so it's about getting together and allowing them to have these types of conversations in order to solve issues. And sometimes, at least at the telco level, it'll be potentially the company with the most presence or the one that is least state-owned. Normally, they don't, like, this is another distinction, right? Like private companies, specifically ISPs, will not collaborate with state-owned companies, which is an issue in and of itself. But really, like the one with the most market presence, or the one that has these platforms, will be able to kind of respond more vocally than some of the other smaller players. But it's important to have these frameworks and these places so that they can respond. And then, yeah, the multi-stakeholder engagement is extremely relevant. And this includes bringing in civil society, right? Ensuring that civil society is listened to, and that, you know, the private sector really does kind of hear what the potential harms can be. And I think the last point I'll make is on the investor point, because I think that's, you mentioned that as well. Investors have a lot of power in terms of really ensuring that companies hold rights-respecting approaches. Some of them will carry out some of these analyses because their investors make them. I'm not saying it's all of them, of course. Some of them like do it on their own, but that is like, if you take a look at the ecosystem, I think that's another important part to kind of look at. And so even as situations go on, it's really relevant to think about, and I think you mentioned this, like the pre-conflict or the pre-situation versus the ongoing versus the post. And in our learning series, it's a short document, it's 8 pages, but because a lot of this is just very sensitive in terms of how it's discussed, but it's super relevant to continue to use the multi-stakeholder approach and the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights to continue to take a human rights-centered approach to conflict. I think I'll close with that. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, my panelists, for your initial remarks. I'm going to check.
Felicia, had I add to like some?
Yes, but okay. I would, once Iman is done, I would check. If you have a question, please raise your hand so we know how many questions we can take, and then we'll come back to the panelists. So you're not just in, but you're also contributing to the discussion.
Mention them, still connect to the internet. And the second thing that we have, and I think I wanna mention WhatsApp specifically. In WhatsApp, you have something called WhatsApp proxy. So whenever there is throttling that takes place, one of the things that you could do is use WhatsApp proxy. What it does, like, and do not want to get technical at all, is that usually you send the message, it goes to the WhatsApp server, and then it goes to whoever you're sending the message to. If the throttling happens, you no longer see this server. So the WhatsApp proxy basically creates this alternative server and relays this information. So you send the message, it goes to that proxy server, and then it goes to the WhatsApp server. So it really helps at times where you think that the WhatsApp might be blocked or, you know, throttled or blocked, but the internet is already there. And that's one of the things, because of the unit that I work in, and I work with high-risk user, whenever something's about to happen, whenever examinations are about, not examinations, that's a bad example, but whenever you predict because of protest or anything that this might be happening, I think that civil society should, you know, like, and we have this published on WhatsApp, like on the page, about how you could set up a WhatsApp proxy. So how to set up a server. And this crisis policy protocol guides how we look at a country and what sort of policies, exceptions we make. So, for example, for the Sudan, Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, Russia specifically did, like for Sudan, is designate the Rapid Support Forces, one of the partners, one of the parties of war. And we've done this like early on the onset of the conflict, and, you know, because of communication with a lot of the UN human rights organization, a lot of diaspora human rights organizations, civil society organizations across the board. Another thing that we've done, and I think designating it as a high-risk location was important because, again, during armed conflict, you're looking at people, like calls for weaponizing people. So these calls, or like going to a specific location, are then removed. Other things that we also have during conflict is because of the health situation in Sudan and the bombing of hospitals, we allowed the sales of, we had the policy exception, we allowed the sales of medication. That's also one of the different elements and aspects that the company does, right? So I know that looking at the internet shutdown like as one part, but I think looking at how the platform supports the lives of people when the lives of people are no longer moving becomes a lifeline. And I think just highlighting that was something very important for me to share with everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. And I wanted to just ask again about the WhatsApp proxy and how you, like, do you engage with civil society on this, or how do we get connected to be able to make sure that people are really aware of this and can use that as an alternative during blocking of WhatsApp?
So yes, of course, it's on the website. Happy to share this with you. If you need a training, who has a tech person at a civil society organization can create it. Of course, the more you socialize this, the more you add protection. Know what they're gonna face when they go offline, when they're in protest, right? They know how to engage, who to engage when you speak with legal, what are the things that you should do if you're, like arrested, etc. I think that when we say that we are expanding into this online space, these rules should also be known. Any sort of instability to share this online. We have a website that I keep speaking about called Defenders Safe, and this allows you to do 3 things. One, it has the digital security training. We say these things that people don't use it, but it's so important to protect yourself and use the digital security. The second thing it has is that it has helplines, especially if you're a minority or a marginalized group. Speaking to the helpline would be able to expedite, like a number of things. If you're detained, if you're arrested, if you need to have your, sort of page taken down, especially if you're in a country where it's an authoritarian regime or there are cybersecurity, cybercrime laws that can, like go against international human rights. This fund really helps you if you need legal aid, if you need to leave the country. That's particularly important, again, for the same reasons. But for marginalized groups across like the world, including, like Africa, Middle East, and Turkey, which I'm part of, especially like naming LGBTQ communities, I think they should make use of these resources that already exist.
All right, thank you. And then I want to check in the room if there are questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And then, okay, I don't see any hand. Okay, there's one hand. We don't have a mic to move around. Okay.
Does this work?
Yeah, working.
Yeah, okay.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Moi c'est Abdou Aziz Sissé. Je suis membre de Africtiviste. Merci beaucoup pour les différentes interventions. Le cas du Soudan est un cas qui nous alerte et qui doit tous nous importer, en fait, nous faire réagir en tant qu'Africains. Et on a décelé un manque de solidarité de la part de plusieurs organisations de la société civile depuis le début de ce qui se passe au Soudan. Nous, à Africtiviste, par solidarité panafricaine, au tout début de la guerre civile, nous avons en fait publié un communiqué en guise de solidarité. Et en juillet dernier aussi, nous avons organisé, et en fait cette guerre civile fait partie des moments techniques qui nous ont poussé, c'est un prétexte qui nous a poussé à organiser une conférence qu'on a appelé Bâtir la solidarité, parce que ça manque, afin de rassembler les mouvements et organisations de la société civile africains pour mettre en place cette solidarité-là et venir en soutien à ceux qui en ont besoin dans nos différents pays. Récemment, il y a une organisation, un mouvement citoyen sénégalais que tout le monde devrait connaître ici, qui s'appelle Y en a marre. Ils ont mis en place une maison qu'ils ont appelé Caribou, qui veut dire bienvenue en Swahili, où ils peuvent accueillir des activistes, des militants qui se sentent menacés dans leur pays. Donc ça, c'est des actions qu'on doit peut-être essayer de réfléchir comment mettre en place dans plusieurs pays du continent, dans des pays comme le Soudan. Je pense que c'est très intéressant d'avoir ces genres de structures-là qui permettent à ces militants de quitter le pays et de pouvoir faire le travail qu'ils faisaient peut-être dans leur pays. Il y a quelqu'un qui a parlé de désinformation. C'est très important parce qu'actuellement, c'est l'un des plus grands fléaux de notre temps. Moi, la question que j'ai, c'est, je pense que déjà, organiser ce panel, organiser ce forum, c'est mettre en place cette solidarité. Mais quelles sont je dirais, les mesures ou les mécanismes qu'on doit mettre en place pour que cette solidarité-là soit quelque chose de concret, afin que chacun puisse être concerné par ce qui se passe ailleurs, parce qu'on parle de panafricanité. Merci beaucoup.
Hello again. I am Jane Larson from IMS. I think I'm going to ask a question that's a little bit related to something, the other side of the coin. If the social networks are actually used to chase a certain minority in a given conflict, what can platforms do where we see internet shutdowns, in order to repress civil society, but we can also see sometimes even state bodies use the networks to chase certain minorities. So what are some of the concrete actions that can be done in the design of the apps to either slow down comments or to quickly remove speech that relates to hate crimes or potentially turn into genocide? What are the design options? And I'm not a programmer. I don't know how to program these apps, but I have seen Google coming out with some suggestions to how they can turn off comments, or I don't know how this works. So I would like your input on that. If do you even detect it before it runs wild in a country, and what can be done at a design level where you can actually have authorities that are also good authorities. They don't know how to deal with this, so they simply shut off the internet in order to not having this run entirely wild. So this is a little bit the flip side of the coin, where we're in another type of a conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wakabi is my name. We've heard that tech companies rarely do due diligence in conflict situations. And my question is, what are the major reasons why they don't? And are we seeing moves that indicate that more of them, particularly those that operate within Africa, are likely to be doing those kinds of due diligence? The other question, that's a general question to everyone, but the other one is to Ayman. I think she mentioned that Meta does conflict sensitivity analysis and similar analysis done around elections. The question is, do you share the findings of those reports with the public, with some other stakeholders, or they are purely for informing actions by the organization and are shared internally only? Thank you very much.
All right, we'll respond to the 3 questions and then we'll come back. So you can start. I think 2 questions were directed to you.
Sure. I think I'll start with the last one because just really straightforward. So yes, we do like these analyses to inform our policies and how we take action internally. And when we do that, usually whatever we do during conflict or during election, you'll find it in our human rights report. So we publish a human rights report annually. our human rights report of 2023 was just published last week or this week, Monday. I can't remember exactly. So basically it speaks about all of these things. We also have a transparency center that speaks about all the different other things that we do when it comes to things that, like, for example, if we disrupted the network, if we have takedown requests from government, all of these things you can also find there. So yes, we publish them. So it's meant to inform us and also inform people about some of the threats or what we've been doing about high-risk events. For the other question about, and I think it's such a good question about what can people do and what can governments do. You're right, there's a lot of times where governments don't know what to do about it. And that's why the easiest thing is to shut down the internet. So we actually have a number of we have public policy teams that deal specifically with governments. And these teams usually engage with governments and, try to explain to them how things can work and how they can also use the online platforms to address these emerging situations, right? So how they can maintain their online presence while also supporting this appropriate counter speech. So that is something that happens. We engage with the governments, with the regulators, with the law enforcement, etc., and we have teams that engage with them. If you ask about how we do this with normal people or civil society, etc., especially when you look at minorities, speech is one of these things that changes frequently, and it's really hard to capture it at any point. I'll tell you for the Sudan case that the hate speech words that were used pre-war are very different than the ones we've used now. So usually, what happens is you have these hate speech words that are being used, and the system knows them. So and the AI, by the way, captures more than 99% of that. But the challenge with it is that this 1% is a lot, and this 1% causes harm, right? And that's why we're trying to be even more proactive. So we do this by training, provide us with words that they're seeing on the ground, and because words change actively with that, and that's why we have working groups about voice and expression with LGBTQ communities, with women, specifically because we see sexual violence and CII. We have different groups that we engage with that deal specifically with migrants and irregular migration. And there you can imagine that smuggling in itself and just human exploitation just increases during war. So we engage with, maybe what I want to say is that we engage with different stakeholders depending on what are the challenges we're seeing on the ground, and we prioritize, and based on it, we start this engagement. And sometimes, by the way, these conversations lead to a policy change within Meta. If we find that this was a big issue and we haven't really noticed, then one of the things that it can lead to a policy change within the community standards of Meta.
Yeah, I can comment on probably the same two questions, again, from the civil society side. So first on, human rights due diligence and conflict. I will say that while we have seen some human rights impact assessments and due diligence being made public, there's still a whole lot more that the tech sector can do. There are some cases where we've been told as civil society, yes, we did this human rights due diligence, but we're not going to show it to you because there are some other reasons. And while there are certainly situations where it can be sensitive to share kind of the full results of an impact assessments or due diligence, I think there is still much more that we can expect companies, social media platforms to do in being transparent about what sort of risks they're identifying and what they're doing to address it. And on the points about it was more focused on design options for content governance. I would say from the policy side, Access Now, we do have a report that my colleagues worked on principles for content governance in times of crisis. And it's specifically aimed at social media platforms with recommendations of what they should do when they're operating before, during, and after conflict. So there are concrete things that they can do, which Iman has mentioned, and a lot of it is honestly just continued conversation with civil society, with the experts who see what's happening. Companies do content moderation even when there's no conflict. right? But when we have war, you have conflict, it's a heightened attention that should be paid to it. So understanding, yeah, how certain words, the importance of certain words change in the middle of conflict, like for companies to understand those nuances, they need to be in conversation with the experts, with civil society specifically, and with impacted communities who know the fast changing and like rapid nature of these things. But yeah, I would say like the content governance principles in times of crisis are really good standard, and we're happy to share some of those with you if it's of interest.
I think from the human rights due diligence perspective, I agree that there is work to do on transparency. I think it's complicated to do sometimes with so many evolving conflicts. It depends on the size of the company you're talking about too. But the conflict series that we ran, I think, was a good first step to discuss these things, where we had 3 series, like we had 60 participants discussing specifically armed conflict over the course of 3 different sessions. But I will say, because a lot of this is like evolving, even some of the partners weren't comfortable like sharing so much of the conversation, which is what the tricky part is. Like, this is why it took us so long, as I was confused about the when the report was actually published and why it's only 8 pages. Is because of that, right? And because of the tension that I also noted, at least when it relates to armed conflict, in terms of like an employee versus like the entity of being a company, and that's like very tricky. And so I think that, yes, more can be done, and I think it's just creating more spaces like that where we invite other people to come and voice their perspectives and can be a part of the conversation. I think that's something that's important.
All right, the first question was about how solidarity can be more concrete, and you did highlight some examples of how Affectivists and other organizations have supported partners or people in Sudan about the conflict and what's going on. I would like to also highlight that solidarity is something that is really important in the advocacy against shutdowns, and this we see under the Keep It On campaign, which is like a global coalition of over 300 organizations, and we do mobilize efforts to push back against internet shutdowns. We raise awareness about what is happening, and so we've done a lot of advocacy around Sudan and other places where internet shutdowns have been weaponized during conflicts, and we do also engage behind the scenes with various stakeholders like the UN, the Freedom Online Coalition, and other governments to ensure that action is taken in response to conflict-related situations. And so I think that without solidarity, we cannot go anywhere as civil society, and that is why we need to always work together. Sometimes we actually have situations where partners on the ground cannot do the advocacy themselves because of obvious security reasons, and so the Keep It On coalition will take up that against a particular too much. But if you the session, and then we can see how.
I want to add something about, you know, like the solidarity and the advocacy. Of course, like I think that's like such an important thing, and I think that's the power of civil society, because they are not limited by a country, but they can go across. And, you know, like I love the good practice, or like, you know, the example you gave. So of course they can share, you know, good practices in advocacy, plan together, etc. I do think specifically in conflict, and when you speak about migrants and speak about, you know, displacement, people move from the countries they're in to other countries, and sometimes things happen with that. We know that migrants are a marginalized group, right, worldwide, and whenever there's like any high-risk event, migrants are targeted across the world. You see them in narratives specifically during election and conflict. So I think that's one of the elements where civil society can actually play such a big role. Like, so just to take Sudan, for example, a lot of the Sudanese have moved to Uganda, they've moved to Kenya, they have moved to Egypt, they have moved to Ethiopia, they've moved to Chad, right? you're speaking about Swahili and Arabic and I don't know, Amharic and Tigrania, and you're speaking about French. There's a lot of hate speech that can come around migrants, which is very hard to pick up immediately. And I think this is a very interesting role for civil society to play and start flagging these issues like early on to like Meta or just flagging the system, because you hear them and that it can change with new people coming in and new words coming in. And I do think that this is something that, you know, like will hold also platforms accountable when you're able to raise these issues to us. Thank you.
Oui, merci beaucoup. C'est juste pour dire un mot sur la diligence raisonnable. Comme je l'ai mentionné lors de mon intervention, nous, à l'époque, nous avions approché 104 entreprises pour avoir plus d'informations sur leur diligence raisonnable. Et malheureusement, on a eu seulement 4 réponses. Cela montre combien ces entreprises aiment faire dans l'opacité. Je pense que la question de la diligence raisonnable est tellement importante, mais malheureusement, il s'avère que beaucoup d'entreprises ne veulent pas en trop parler, ne veulent pas trop en parler, et c'est dommage. Donc, une fois de plus, je pense qu'on doit tout faire pour amener les entreprises à être beaucoup plus transparentes. Et ce manque de transparence n'est pas seulement... c'est pas vraiment l'apanage des entreprises de technologie. On a aussi avec les entreprises de télécommunications, et là aussi, nous avions fait une étude dans ce sens. Nous avions approché 15 entreprises de télécommunications et malheureusement, parmi ces 15-là, on a eu seulement 2 réponses. Et donc, une fois de plus, il y a vraiment un problème de transparence au niveau des entreprises d'une manière générale. Et puis, rapidement aussi, pour mentionner qu'au niveau de notre organisation, nous savons ce qu'on appelle le Company Response Mechanism. Donc, dans des pays comme le Soudan, mais pas seulement, d'une manière générale, nous l'utilisons. Par exemple, quand il y a des allégations très importantes, ça peut être un article, un rapport. Une fois que nous sommes convaincus de la véracité du document, et que l'entreprise ou les entreprises qui sont impliquées dans ces allégations n'ont pas encore publiquement répondu aux dites allégations, nous les contactons directement et nous essayons de les amener à s'exprimer publiquement sur les allégations. Et je pense que c'est une démarche très importante parce que ça permet aux entreprises quand même de savoir que les allégations qui peut-être n'étaient pas aussi audibles sont désormais audibles au niveau international. Et que si jamais l'entreprise ne répond pas, nous n'hésitons pas à mettre ça vraiment à la disposition de tout notre réseau. Donc c'est un moyen supplémentaire de mettre la pression sur les entreprises pour qu'au moins elles puissent avoir un comportement, en tout cas bon, et dans la mesure du possible, irréprochable. Merci.
All right. Thank you. Okay, we have a few more minutes left, so I want to come back to you. And we want to make this, we need recommendations, so concrete recommendations from this session. And so I want to start with, Mashra? Yeah, what recommendations or key considerations do you have for tech companies and the private sector operating in conflict situations?
I think continue the multi-stakeholder approach, join GNI if you're not part of GNI. But also, I think continue to conduct human rights due diligence and specifically in heightened human rights due diligence on different products. I think those are like my main recommendations, and also continue to engage meaningfully with civil society. I think the meaningfully word is very important. Consider context, consider culture, consider language. Those are my main recommendations.
Thank you.
it does get a little bit too much for civil society to have to engage with Access Now, they have to engage with, GNI, they have to engage with Meta. And I do think that having these shared advocacy platforms really helps. And I speak about this specifically when you speak about resources, whether the resource of time or whether the resource of financial money. I do think that, we can lean on each other where some are better when it comes to research, etc. I do think that this makes better use and we're able to, have specific impacts and also raise issues. And I want to say that these forums such as, FIFA Africa and others are really good platforms to understand things that we're missing out on. I know that internet shutdown is something that we've been called out on 2 years ago, for example. I know that's something we're working on that we've been called out on as well. This year is surveillance, something that we haven't really noticed or haven't paid attention to, and we're working on. So I think that's also a call to just see, between ourselves, make it a point that we should, have specific meetups and, have whether advocacy groups, etc., where we can flag these issues early and work on it because the impact would be greater.
Yeah, you did mention this before we got in,
Yes.
and I think, yes, we'll connect with you and see how we can have one space where we don't have to duplicate efforts, but then we can be able to coordinate in response to some of these crisis moments. Okay, Sedwa.
So I would have three recommendations. First is that companies should start thinking about these issues much earlier, right? Before conflict, before you enter a market. Not all conflicts are predictable, but a lot are. And I know that companies do certain kinds of risk assessments before they enter new markets, generally on corruption and the financial side. But you can also do a similar human rights assessment before entering to identify situations that can turn into conflict. We mentioned Myanmar earlier. The conflict in Myanmar didn't just start in 2021. Telenor entered well before and had a long time to think about what they would do when things escalated. So first is think early and think at the entry stage about protocols for conflict. And secondly, particularly for large multinational companies, during conflict and even out of conflict, it's really important to continue to keep the same level of human rights respect across the jurisdictions where they operate in. In some places, we have rule of law and legislation that's stronger. In other places, it's weaker. But companies can play a really important role in sort of filling that gap and ensuring that, at the minimum, the same human rights respect that you're giving to your users in the US or in Europe are the same that you're giving to your users in other parts of the world. And the third point is sort of similar to that, particularly for content moderation, which is for companies, specifically platforms, to invest more in non-English language content. That's really important in understanding how things escalate quickly, because by the time it's translated to English and in English media, then things have already moved further ahead. So for companies to spend more resources, investing in smaller local languages will make it easier during conflict to follow the situation and to do the sort of content moderation that's necessary to ensure that the company is not contributing to exacerbating the conflict on the ground.
Merci beaucoup. Moi, je pense que je vais insister sur 2 points, à savoir la diligence raisonnable. Moi, je pense que c'est très important pour que les entreprises, notamment celles qui opèrent dans une zone de conflit, et en particulier les entreprises de technologie, d'avoir une très bonne diligence raisonnable, parce que cela permet de prévenir, d'anticiper, de mitiger et de corriger les éventuels abus. Mais sans cela, j'ai l'impression que beaucoup d'entreprises naviguent à vue, ou en tout cas sont dans leur petit coin et font ce qu'elles pensent être bon, ce qui n'est pas toujours évident. L'autre point que j'aimerais suggérer aussi, c'est vraiment la synergie entre les organisations de la société civile. Moi, je pense que l'union fait la force. Et je pense que les alliances, les coalitions, les collaborations entre les différentes organisations de la société civile sont plus que jamais nécessaires. Et la force, il n'y en a jamais de trop quand on est en face des entreprises et des États. Il nous faut la pression et encore la pression. Et pour cela, il faut que la société civile, d'une manière générale, soit encore beaucoup plus unie et qu'ensemble, on puisse faire avancer les droits de l'homme dans les activités commerciales partout dans le monde. Merci.
Thank you very much for the recommendations. Okay, we can spare 5 minutes and check if there are further questions or comments, or let us know your feedback about the panel, if it was useful to you or not. And then we also have some resources in front. You can have some stickers, some QR codes to access some of the content that we've mentioned at Access Now. And then, yeah, we want to give you some time back so you can go see beautiful Dakar. All right, okay. Where's the mic? Microphone?
I don't know, but I think we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Translation.
This is Jimmy from Uganda. Our law enforcement specifically. I want to thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. As we design the different tools, as we design the different methods to support people navigate these spaces, we need to be conscious of the different literacy levels, absorption levels, and also remembering that children are also in this space. And of course, children by virtue of their age online, not the real age. So designing programs that will help them in such spaces is very critical. Sometimes we presume that everybody actually understands, like when Imani talked about the WhatsApp proxy, it could be very easy from where you sit, but not very easy for where another person sits. So I think legislative bodies is very, very important so that we can create unifying and generally acceptable standards. Not acceptable, but generally acceptable standards. I thank you so much for that.
Okay, are you ready? Is there another? Okay, there's a hand at the back. I promise to let you go in 2 minutes.
Ok. Bonsoir. Je m'appelle Urbain Kiswensida Yameogo. Je fais partie du Centre d'information et de formation en matière de droits humains en Afrique, qui est une organisation de la société civile basée au Burkina Faso. Je voudrais aussi préciser que nous sommes partenaires de confiance donc de Facebook. Et à ce titre, donc, nous travaillons sur tout ce qui touche donc, au monitoring donc, des contenus, afin de s'assurer que ce qui est publié réponde aux exigences des membres donc, de la communauté donc, de Facebook. Et justement, je voudrais à la fois saluer donc, la présence donc, de Madame, mais aussi rappeler justement la situation spécifique donc, de certains pays. Vous avez évoqué donc, le cas, par exemple, du Soudan. Vous n'êtes pas non plus sans savoir que les pays du Sahel donc, sont dans une relative donc, fragilité et confrontés donc, aux problématiques donc, du terrorisme. Donc la question c'est comment est-ce que Facebook, comme d'autres plateformes, donc, peuvent travailler à donner la priorité donc, à tout ce qui est signalé donc, dans ces zones qui sont particulièrement problématiques, étant donné le contexte actuel de circulation, surtout donc, de fausses informations, mais aussi et surtout les actes de cybercriminalité et les discours donc, de haine qui de plus en plus donc, se développent. C'est vrai que nous voyons, nous sentons qu'il y a des évolutions donc, dans le renforcement donc, du canal donc, du signalement donc, des partenaires de confiance, mais nous estimons qu'il y a encore beaucoup de choses à faire parce que malheureusement, comme vous avez eu à le dire, assez souvent, entre le temps où l'information donc, est publiée, le temps où nous faisons le signalement, Et le temps de la prise en charge, malheureusement, le pire a été fait. Et donc, quand bien même donc, Facebook réagit, le mal est fait et il est difficile donc d'apporter donc des solutions. Voilà ce que je voulais apporter comme contribution et comme question. Merci.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's good to see you, one of the TPs that we have here. I don't specifically work on Sahel region, but I'll tell you that the Sahel region has a specific team that's working on it. Sahel has, of course, like I understand the sensitivity and the fragility of the situation in Sahel. And I think that's why Sahel region is also one of the regions where we consider as high risk, you know, for us at the company, and we work on it. It has an advantage because it has shared languages. So it has an advantage that, you know, French is one of the languages, Hausa is one of the languages. So it has this shared advantages across the board. And I know that with the teams that work on it is that they have a number of civil society organizations in addition to the TP. So like the human rights defenders, I think predominantly human rights defenders and activists is who they deal with in the Sahel, and LGBTQ communities. So I can't speak much about what has happened, but I know that the processes are exactly the same. So they engage with them, they flag issues early, they support with specific keywords alongside with the TPs. There are things that they've done for misinformation specifically, so I know that they have persistently harmful claims that exist. So if a claim is made several times and we know that it has harm, then one of the things that happens is that it's automatically, you know, like considered removed, you know, like one of the things that we don't, with misinformation, we reduce, we inform, we don't remove easily, right? So I think like one of the things that happened with Sahel also because of the different countries that share the same sort of issues, like we've removed persistently harmful claims. But yeah, I can connect you, you're connected to Meta, but if you want, I'm happy to connect you further to the colleague who works on this specifically.
All right, thank you all so much. I just want to re-echo some of the key takeaways from this session. The first one is businesses cannot be neutral. The second one is solidarity. And the third one is multi-stakeholderism. And so these are the key words we should take away, and we look forward to working with all of you in advancing digital rights in Africa and around the globe. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.